In this video, we will show you how to replace your front lower control arm on this Chevy Silverado. This is part of your front suspension, located behind your front wheel. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. The first thing we need to do is safely raise and support the vehicle so the front wheel's off the ground. Once you've done that, continue on to removing your center cover using a 22mm socket, and then we'll remove all 6 of our 22mm lug nuts located behind it. Get the wheel off of here. Now that we have the wheel off, we're going to start removing the caliper from the area. If you were to look along the backside, you're going to find that you have 2 18mm headed bolts to remove. Use an 18mm to remove these bolts. Once you remove the mounting bolts, give it a quick inspection. If it looks like it's rotted and damaged, you have to go ahead and replace these. I'll start that one in just a couple threads here and fully remove the other one. Slide this off of here. A quick inspection of your brake pads, of course. If it looks like they are worn or damaged in any way, it's a good idea to go ahead and replace the brakes. We'll set this aside, putting no pressure on the flex hose temporarily. Let's remove the brake rotor. We'll give this a quick inspection. Once again, if it looks like it's rotted, go ahead and replace the front brakes. With the rotor out of the way, the next thing that we need to do is pay attention to our ABS wire. This ABS wire comes from the wheel bearing all the way up across the upper control arm, across the frame, and it mounts in up along the top here where you're going to find a wire connector. To dislodge this connector, go ahead and take hold of that locking tab, lift it up just a little bit, and disconnect the connector. A quick inspection for corrosion. We'll set one side aside and continue on with disconnecting the rest of that ABS wiring harness. Right there's the little locking tab. You can just lift up on that. You could use your fingers or a small prying device. You can even use a small pocket screwdriver if you need it. If you see any funny colors in this area, that would be corrosion and it needs to be dealt with. This one looks fine. Let's start dislodging that ABS wire. You can use a trim tool or a small prying device for this. Just make your way underneath it and lift it up and out of place. As we make our way along this area, you can find that you can use a small screwdriver to dislodge each one of these clips without actually removing them from the frame. This one in here. Make its way underneath this caliper. To dislodge it from this area, you'd want to squeeze on these 2 ears right along this area and pull it out of place towards the front of the vehicle. You can use some long nose pliers for this. A quick inspection of that ABS wire, and now we're going to tie it up around the wheel bearing here. We don't want it to get damaged while we continue this process. With that ABS wire out of the way, let's continue on to our brake flex hose mounting bracket. You'll find that this is held in place with one 8mm headed bolt. A quick inspection of that bolt and we'll set it aside. Take hold of the bracket, give it a wiggle and lift it up and out of place. At this point, you want to be extremely careful that the caliper does not fall off one direction or the other. You can use a strap and tie it up in place. We'll just hang it aside, putting no pressure on the flex hose. I've got a hook on this area. We'll just bring this down. Like I said, we're paying attention to the flex hose, causing no damage here. Let's continue on to removing the outer tie rod end from the steering knuckle here. To remove this, you'll find that you have a locking cotter pin. Go ahead and remove that and dispose of it properly. Continue on with an 18mm. The next thing you'll have to do is separate the outer tie rod end from your steering knuckle. If you're not replacing the outer tie rod end, you want to be extremely careful not to damage it in any way. You could damage the boot or even the studded area. Now, to separate this, you could use a hammer and just cause some light vibration here, and that should break it free. A quick inspection of that outer tie rod end, make sure it's not damaged. If it is, like I said, you have to go ahead and replace it. This looks fine, we'll set it aside. Move along to your lower ball joint mounting nut. Use a 24mm for this. A quick inspection of that mounting nut. We'll start it back on there, just a couple threads. Make your way to the upper ball joint mounting nut. Remove this with a swivel 18mm. At this point, we can continue on causing a little bit more vibration. We need to separate the knuckle from the upper and the lower ball joints. I'm going to start tapping up along where the upper ball joint makes its way through the knuckle here. We're being careful not to cause any damage to that ball joint while doing so. You can use some penetrant if needed. Now that I have the upper ball joint dislodged, we're going to continue tapping, but this time it's going to be lower on the knuckle. There we are. Let's get this off of here. With the knuckle out of the way, the next thing that we're going to do is pay attention to that upper ball joint. We need to confirm that we caused no damage and the boot is still in good working order. Let's apply some support underneath the lower control arm. While holding pressure under this area, it's time to start removing the sway bar link. To remove the sway bar link, you'll find that you have a nut up along the top here, and the bolt actually goes through the entire center of each one of the bushings, the washers, and the sleeve, all the way down to the bottom where the control arm is. We'll be using a 15mm in this area and hold the top with some pliers. As you continue removing the sway bar link, give it a close inspection. If it looks like it's damaged or worn in any way, it's a good idea to go ahead and replace it. And when you replace it as a pair. We'll lower down the control arm as needed here. You may find that there's pressure in between the sway bar and the control arm here, holding the sway bar link in place. If that's the case, you could carefully try to release pressure from the sway bar by gently using a pry bar. This one looks okay. We'll set the sway bar link aside. Continuing underneath the control arm, it's time to dismount the lower shock from the control arm itself. You'll find that you have two 13mm headed bolts holding this in place. Go ahead and remove the pair. Inspect your mounting hardware, replace it as necessary, of course. With those bolts out of there, let's continue applying upward pressure on the lower control arm. We're trying to raise that up enough that we can twist the lower portion of the shock so it can fit through this lower hole. Follow the lower control arm to where it connects onto the frame. We'll be using an 18mm and a 24mm. We have to loosen the forward bolt here and the rearward bolt, and then we can start pivoting the lower control arm down so we can start removing the coil spring. My 18mm wrench. Let's do the same for the rear mounting bolt here. With those bolts loose, let's continue on safely lowering the control arm down. While doing so, you need to be paying attention to the coil spring. We don't want to let this fall out of here. Once you have the control arm down far enough, we can take the coil spring and carefully slide it out, down, and away from that front shock. Something to note is to be able to get the coil spring out of here, you're going to have to lower that front control arm down considerably far. Keep that in mind as we continue. Be careful for any pinch points as you continue doing this. Okay, this is getting close now. We're holding onto the coil spring. Okay, I'm just going to remove the support here. The control arm will swing down. Let's take hold of the coil spring and carefully pull it down and off of the front shock. There it is, friend. We'll give this a quick inspection and set it aside. Let's continue back at each one of those mounting bolts. You should find that you have a washer on the end there. Continue on to holding onto that control arm. We'll remove each one of the mounting bolts. Keep in mind the control arm is considerably heavy. Remove the control arm from the vehicle. And there it is, friend. Continue on to cleaning your mounting points where your brand new control arm will sit. Use a wire brush for this. Clean and inspect your mounting bolts. Okay, let's get ready for the installation of our brand new front lower control arm. We'll get this in position. Once you have it slid in position, continue on with your two mounting bolts. You'll find that one's a little longer than the other. The longer bolt is for the rear mounting bolt, and the shorter bolt is for the front. Get some thread locker on the threads here. Install your washers and your locking nuts. Once you have this area started on, pause. We'll continue on with our coil spring. When you go to put the coil spring in position, we're going to slide it around the shock all the way up to the top of the strut tower there. But we'll also be paying attention down at the control arm as we bring the control arm into position along the bottom of the coil spring. You'll see that you have this area on the control arm where the very end of the coil spring does need to sit. Once we have everything in place, we'll continue on with applying upward pressure on that lower control arm, and we can continue on. The next thing we'll do is pay attention down where that lower shock connects to that control arm. We'll make sure that the shock makes its way through the hole, align the mounting bolt holes, and start in each one of those 2 mounting bolts. Start in each one of your 13mm mounting bolts, snug them up, and then torque those to 19 foot-pounds. Let's continue on to our lower control arm mounting bolts. You want to make sure that you tighten and torque these with the suspension in the normal ride height position, essentially while we're still holding pressure under this area. Just go ahead and snug these and then torque each of them to 139 foot-pounds. Go ahead and remove support from underneath that lower control arm, and we'll continue on with the sway bar link. For the sway bar link, we'll be taking the shaft area with the bushing and the lower washer, and go ahead and take this and put it through the bottom of the control arm. You want to make sure you have the bushing and the washer inside the hole before you continue on too much further here. We can leave the bolt down low though. Continue on with the center portion. That should have the bushings and the other washers attached directly to it. Slide that right down on there. Now we'll swing this into position. At this point, you may have to raise or lower the sway bar as needed to get this to fit into position. Let's be extremely careful doing this. There we are. Now that I have that in place, we'll continue on with the upper mounting nut. You can tell that this does have a shanked area, which will go through the bar, and then also down into the bushing here. We'll snug this up and torque it to 81 inch-pounds. Let's reinstall the steering knuckle here. Align the lower ball joint with the lower mounting port. Continue on with your lower ball joint mounting nut. We'll start this on by hand. Now that we have the lower mounting nut started, let's continue on with the pry bar. We're going to go across the top of the upper control arm and underneath the coil spring area. You should be able to pivot this now with a little bit of leverage. Now let's take the steering knuckle and swing it into position. Align it with that upper ball joint stud, pull down on the control arm to put this in position. With both of those started on, let's make our way back down to the lower ball joint nut. We'll be using our 24mm, snug this up, and torque it to 74 foot-pounds. Now once you have this torqued, the next thing that you will want to do if you have a castle nut on your ball joint is continue on by putting in your locking cotter pin. If the slot is not aligned with the hole on your ball joint, continue tightening until the very next slot is, and then put in your locking cotter pin. Make sure you pin it over. Make your way to your upper ball joint mounting nut. Let's bottom this out and torque it to 37 foot-pounds. If you find you're having a hard time tightening this because the ball joint stud spins, Continue applying pressure along the top of the control arm, holding it down into the knuckle while you continue. Now it's time for the outer tie rod end. Go ahead and take this and put it in position. Once you have that slid in there, we'll continue on with our nut. Start this on by hand, snug it up, and then you want to torque that to 48 foot-pounds. Once you have this torqued, the next thing that you need to do is pay attention to the slots on the mounting nut in comparison to the hole that goes through the stud. Align it. If for some reason it's not aligned, continue tightening the nut until it is, and then put in your locking cotter pin. Now it's time to re-secure our flex hose. I'm going to take the caliper and put it back in position over here. We'll make sure it doesn't fall down while we continue. If you were to look along the top of the steering knuckle, you're going to find two ports. I used some copper anti-seize directly inside of each one of these ports. The forward one is the one for your mounting bolt, the other one's for the locating tab on your flex hose bracket. Let's take this and put it in position, aligning that tab with the hole, and then start in the mounting bolt and snug it up. Double check, make sure it's nice and secure. Let's continue with the ABS wire. We'll take this and bring it behind the flex hose here. Now we can connect this into its corresponding bracket. Just press it in. Listen for a click from that. Let's continue on down the line. Slide this on there. Press it in, listen for a click from that. We'll make our way up here. The next thing we'll do is continue on with connecting in our two wires, and then we'll slide that wire connector down into its locked position. Press that in, listen for a click, give it a little tug. Double check to make sure it's secure. Time to install the grease fitting along the top of the ball joint here. Just start it in by hand and snug it up. Throw some grease in there. Moving along, we're going to clean the mating surface of our wheel bearing and the backside of the rotor. You can use a wire brush and some parts cleaner for this. A little splash of anti-seize. Install your brake rotor. We'll continue on to that caliper. Go ahead and take that and put it in position. Once you have it in position, continue on with your two mounting bolts. Slide this right on over that. We've got our two mounting bolts. Clean the threads. Of course, I'm going to use some thread locker on these. With each one of these two bolts snug, continue on to torquing these to 129 foot-pounds. One last quick inspection in the area and we'll continue on with our wheel. Start on all 6 of your 22mm lug nuts. We'll bottom these out, get the wheel safely back on the ground, and then we can torque each of these to 140 foot-pounds. With the wheel on the ground, we'll torque these in a crisscross manner. Torqued. If you have a center cover, install that now. To install your center cover, you'll notice that you have 6 caps that need to screw onto each one of the lug nuts. Go ahead and align it and install these by hand. You don't want to strip them out. Okay friends, we've got the vehicle back together. The process for one side of the vehicle is the exact same thing as the other. After that, go ahead and take your vehicle for a road test down to your local alignment shop. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.